Well, good morning. Did everyone get a copy of today's handout? I think I got everybody. Well, we're continuing our discussions and study in the topic of leadership again this morning. And if you remember last week, I guess was our second or third week on the topic of qualifications of elders. We're going to spend just a few minutes kind of finishing that up and review just a little bit, and then we're going to move into the sheet you've got this morning. But if you remember, we've been looking at 1 Timothy chapter 3, and that's where we'll spend a lot of our time this morning as well. And again in Titus 1, where we find the qualifications for elders. And just as a quick review, and Thomas, you might have to get me started on the slides up there. We talked about the different qualifications, one being that an elder, anyone desiring the office of an elder desires a noble task. So we talked about how important it is to have a desire for that office and what goes along with that. We talked about some of the moral characteristics, and we may have to do without the slides this morning if they don't work. But we talked about being above reproach, what it means to be above reproach, and what that means. Here we go. Thank you. Then we looked at some domestic characteristics. Husband of one wife, manages his family well. That being a way to see how an elder, a person in the office of elder would handle managing a congregation. And then we talked about some of the kind of personality characteristics, which may be too small for you to see up there, but being sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, not given to drunkenness, not violent or quarrelsome. We talked about how important those characteristics are for someone who's going to serve as an elder, leading a congregation, and how, some of those characteristics, if he were to be a violent or quarrelsome person or given to drunkenness and not respectable, how that could actually cause some division in the congregation if you had someone serving in that capacity for a congregation. Not to mention those are characteristics that, any Christian should strive to have. And then we talked about how important it was to be hospitable and how that doesn't necessarily mean, we tend to think about that here in the South at least as just opening up your home to have people over and entertaining and visiting, which is a part of it, but just a small part of it when it comes to an elder being hospitable. And then we talked about able to teach, or I think some translations talk apt to teach, and how important it is for an elder to be able to teach. And I believe we talked some about how that doesn't necessarily mean just standing in front of a classroom and teaching students, so to speak, even though that can be a part of it, but just having the ability and the knowledge of the Word to be able to explain what the Scripture says to individuals, to groups, and then also knowing the Scripture well enough to be able to know when things are being taught that aren't correct. And then I think this I believe was the last kind of group of characteristics that we had, and I believe this is kind of where we left off, so I kind of went through these kind of quick, so I might slow down just a little bit this morning in case anyone has some comments or discussions on these. But when it comes to an elder's experience, we talk about them being proven not a lover of money, is put in verse 3. And I'll read that again. 1 Timothy 3, verse 3, there it says, again, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. So what does it mean there, not being a lover of money? Some of y'all might have a little bit different wording there depending on what translation you're using. Free from the love of money. Right, right. This kind of ties in with some of the other scriptures where it talks about the love of money being the issue and not necessarily money itself. I believe we talked about that some. We even talked about some how some elders in some churches and maybe in the past, it was even an eldership could have possibly been a paid position. But again, this gets down to it being a motivation thing and not being motivated by money in several ways. Not a recent convert. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, we talked about this some last week too. I don't think any of us have an issue with that. I think we all understand why it'd be important for an elder to not be a recent convert, right? Lack of knowledge is going to be there in some cases. Lack of familiarity maybe with the congregation itself. Right.
If they have not proven themselves to be faithful and understanding and have knowledge of the scripture, that kind of all ties very well together all the way around.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. This is one of the qualifications that we are giving a little explanation of why it is important, just as for those that might not could have heard what Mr. Melvin said there in verse 6, it does, explain that a little bit. ESV says, must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. So I think we've already kind of established being an elder can be a stressful task to take on, can it not? It can be very stressful. So it does take a strong individual, somebody who is rooted in their faith, and a recent convert's not going to have had that opportunity yet to build that foundation, I guess you could say. So how recent is recent? Right. It's going to be an individual thing. I think you're right. So it's not an exact date or amount of time. I think some of it goes back maybe to what Ms. D said. Depends on kind of where that person started from in the first place. Can have some bearing on that. And we know, in the early church, a lot of people were going to be new converts, especially back then. Well thought of by outsiders. Why is that important? Right. Elders are seen somewhat as representatives of the congregation. So if you're not thought of well by by people outside of the congregation in the community, then it's going to make it hard to convert those, and as well as be hard to lead the members of the church if you're not well thought of. What does that mean, though, by well thought of by outsiders? Does that mean that is that a popularity contest? Does that mean everybody out in the community is going to necessarily like the elders? Respect. I think you're right. I think respect. I think it goes back to the above reproach. To me, I think those kind of tie together there. It's the, nothing sticks to them. They're not acting one way out in the community and somewhat differently, in the congregation. And again, there might be people out in the community that may not like elders because they're going to be, like these last words say, upright and holy. So if, some people may not, just like they may not like us as Christians if we're trying to do what's right all the time. But again, it's more of a respect and that sort of more of their reputation, I guess you could say. Any other thoughts on qualifications of elders before we move on to deacons? Again, this is something, just the qualifications in and of itself. We spent a little over 2 weeks on it. You could spend a whole probably quarter just looking at each one of these qualifications and really digging into, the meanings and each little attribute that's mentioned there. And I would encourage you to study more on this on your own. And again, this is qualifications required specifically for elders, but a lot of these, majority of these, are some we could all strive to do better at. And again, these qualifications are here to kind of give us an overall picture of when you're thinking about choosing elders, a person that fits these qualifications. How long should a man serve as an elder? I guess as long as they're qualified and able to do that job would be my thoughts. I'm not aware of anywhere in the scripture that puts a time or date on it.
Much like being a Christian, regardless of how old you are, you don't ever retire from service to the Lord.
Right,
And I know of a good friend of mine in a different congregation that this week has tendered his resignation as an elder because of health
right,
and his ability to make proper decisions because of his health. Each individual elder has to have enough of all the qualifications to realize when it's time for him to step back if necessary or make any other changes as necessary.
right.
So, that's kind of an individual situation. You can't put a stamp that says this, that, and the other.
Yeah, I would say so too. It comes down to the individual case by case basis because it does depend on their life situation, their health sometimes, because again, we've talked about how being an elder requires a lot of time. It can be taxing and stressful, so it all depends on that individual as whether or not they feel that they can continue to conduct themselves in that, at that pace, I guess you could say.
Exactly. This also be a family man,
Right,
a wife, and believing children, marriage and spouse will work.
right, yep,
And this thing, when do you stop being responsible for your children's behavior?
right. That's a,
That's a question that not everyone.
yeah, that's a question, and you can find different ideas on that, within our brotherhood, different thoughts on that and some of those case-by-case situations when it comes up. And again, I think we've talked about with a lot of these qualifications, and especially with that one, there's always a safe path that you can go that is correct when you get into those situations. And I think as Mr. Jim mentioned personally, just from his personal experience, it would be tough to serve as an elder if you didn't have a wife at home to support you. And that's kind of where I would tend to go with it. And when it comes to the children, there's a lot of thoughts on that as well as to, like you said, when do you stop becoming responsible for your children? And with that, my thought on it, you have to look at all of these qualifications as a whole and think about the picture that it paints when you take the children into account. Right, most folks would say that once they're married and they're on their own, you're not responsible for them anymore. But I do think, again, you have to look, if there is that child that has drifted away, at the very least, you need to go back and look at that person you're thinking about as an elder and make sure you're not missing something, is the best way I know to say that, if that even makes sense. But again, there's different thoughts on that, and you have to look for what the safest path is to take when it comes to those type situations. And again, if you're if a congregation is looking at an individual for an elder, if that elder has all these other characteristics, they're going to be open and willing to talk to you about those things too. So you don't have to necessarily just assume and look at the surface saying, oh, if you can't go to that, in my thoughts, if I can't go to Jim and ask him personal questions about things that I might have heard, or again, getting back to, respect of outsiders, if I hear something out in the community that makes me think, oh, that doesn't sound like Mr. Jim, I should go to him and talk to him about it. And, if he's the type person that he is as an elder, he's going to receive that and sit down and have a discussion about it, and, you resolve the issue. So, again, it all has to be taken together as one whole qualification when you're looking at these qualifications. Not to allow any cracks in the armor is a safest route. That's a good way to put it. Somebody else?
It's not a CEO when he respects he's open to their suggestions, what he says, he doesn't turn you off. No, we tried that, we're not gonna do that.
Right.
That won't work.
Yeah.
Listen to his thought.
Yeah. That's the big difference between church organization and elders and leaders and saying, like you said, a CEO of a company. There's a lot of general qualities and guidance out in the world on secular leadership and leading a company, and a lot of it comes back to, even companies that aren't leaders don't even maybe believe in the Bible. When they really look at what's effective as leaders, it comes back to some of these biblical, traits as far as respecting your employees and how you treat them. But when it comes down to it with this, we're not ultimately in a business. The CEO and managers, whatever they say goes, and they don't have to worry about how they treat, because they're not responsible for the employees at home when they go home. Elders are responsible for our souls to some degree, and so there is a different, that brings in a lot of other different responsibilities for them.
I think we don't show enough appreciation to our
Right, that's a good point. Yeah. We tend, I guess, in our society, and of course, I say that maybe it's always been that way, but I know today a lot of times we don't, and maybe it's because not necessarily in the church, but in the world, our leaders maybe don't respect us, or we don't feel like they treat us, so we tend to immediately be harsh and disrespectful and don't show appreciation for their sacrifices. But I think you're right, a lot of times in the church even, we probably don't appreciate them nearly as much as we should, because it is a big task that they're taking on to be our shepherds and lead us. All right, well, let's move into the next topic of deacons, and we're going to do deacons a little bit different. With elders, we're not done talking about elders. We're going, because elders is such a major part in our church leadership, we're going to come back to elders and talk. We've just kind of been talking specifically about the qualifications to get them to being elders, if that sounds right. But we're going to come back and talk to some of the other stuff y'all have mentioned about, what it means to be a shepherd and an overseer and some of their duties. But we're going to move and talk now, change gears a little bit, and hope it doesn't feel like we're jumping back and forth. But I want to cover deacons kind of in its entirety, because really we're not told a whole lot about, quote, the office of deacon in the Bible. What is a deacon? What does the word deacon mean? Servant. Yep, it does. And I'm not going to get a whole lot into language, because I do good to speak English, much less Greek. But it comes from this word here, diakonos, and probably not even how you say it, but that's where the word deacon comes from. And it's used, I think, translated as either servant, or in some places translated as minister. It's occurs like, I think 29 times is what I read in the New Testament. And in most of those places, it's translated as servant, maybe minister. But there are just two, maybe three, depending on what translation of the Bible you're reading from, that will actually translate it as the word deacon. And in those places, it's referring to what we see as the office of deacon. And it's kind of like, I guess it's one of those words that, you know, in the Greek, there's not always a direct translation into English. So the people translating the Bible from Greek to English have to figure out what word to use in those cases, depending on the context. So that's something with a lot of times when we're studying the Bible, you know, a lot of people will tell you, you know, don't just stick to one translation, because these are man translated. So you've got to kind of look and see, and if you see different words used, then, you know, it can be helpful to try to go back to the original language, or go to someone. Josh James always comes to my mind, because he does study the original language a lot. So someone like that can be useful to help you figure out, all right, well, why did this translation use this word and this translation use that word? But just to look at a couple of places where the word deacon is used. If you look at Philippians 1, verse 1, and again, it's not giving us a whole lot of detail on exactly what a deacon does or anything like that, but this is one of the places where the word is translated that way. Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi with the overseers and deacons. I'm reading from ESV. Does anyone have different word besides overseer and deacon there? Bishop be the same as elder, overseer. Does everyone's have deacon in that case? All the ones that I looked through did. Of course, I should have told you, hold your finger in 1 Timothy 3, verse 8. That's the only place where we're really given, you know, with elders, we were looking at 1 Timothy and Titus. With deacons, the only place we're given qualifications for deacons is in 1 Timothy 3, verse 8. And there it just says deacons likewise, and it goes in their qualifications. And we're going to come back to that in just a minute. But Romans 16:1, if you'll turn there, this is one where we may see some differences. And I'll go ahead and tell you now, I don't plan on getting too deep into this verse here, because this is one that causes some confusion for people. My translation, ESV, says, I commend you, Sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Centuria. Does anyone having a translation you're using this morning have something besides servant there? Deaconess. What translation is that? New American Standard. Right, yeah. And you'll see that. And that's one advantage of using Bible app on your phone. A lot of times they'll put little notes that you can click on, and plus you can quickly jump from translation to translation. I believe New American Standard, there was one other I found, and I should have written it down, that uses the word deaconess. Does anyone actually have that in any of your translations? What's that? It could, and I was thinking possibly the NIV, but I'm not sure. King James servant. I think NIV might be the one that the only one I could find that actually uses the word deaconess. Deacon. It actually says, you know, I guess. Right. And so that, again, going on the safe route, when you look at 1 Timothy, it refers to deacons having wives. So she was a servant, right. Right. So, and I think we're all on the same page in that for the most part. I kind of assume we are. But again, that comes back to the translation of the word diakonos, can be servant or minister. And so when the translators got just, I would say same way with baptism, you know, the original word there means to immerse. So instead of just translating it directly to immersion, when it come to the practice of baptism, the translators, you know, I guess they created this English word baptism that we didn't ever use anywhere else. So it's a similar thing here, but for whatever reason, some translations chose to translate that as deacon in that verse.
My translation says can of worms.
Can of worms, yes. And I'm trying not to open that can of worms this morning because I am not a scholar. My main reason for pointing that out to you is that there are people out in the religious world that will use this verse to argue that you can have women serving in the office of deacon. So I mainly wanted to point that out just so that you were aware of it. Because my translation just says servant, but there are translations out there that use deacon there.
Actually, I'm told the word office is not in the Greek. Office is not
Right.
in the Greek.
That's true.
It's been servant, the deacons,
Right.
servant.
It's just a servant. So, and that's all a deacon is a servant. What authority does a deacon have in the congregation? Somewhat of a loaded question. Doesn't have authority, does he? Other than what? Right, right. No authority other than what the elders choose to give the deacons. And that'll probably be something we'll talk a little bit later about when it comes to elders and their responsibilities. And kind of looking along those lines, go to Acts chapter 6, verse 1. Acts 6, yes, sir. And this will be where, everyone's familiar with this story, and we use this set of verses that when we talk about deacons a lot. Acts 6:1 there says, "Now in these days when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenistics arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, 'It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word.' And what they said pleased the whole gathering, and they chose," and then it goes on and lists the 7 men that they chose. Does it say anywhere in there in anybody's translation that they were going to call these guys deacons? And again, it doesn't say anything about office of deacon, but I think we all use this as we all assume, and I feel like it's a safe assumption that that's what deacons do, is what these men do. And again, a deacon is a servant. They have the authority that the elders give them in situations, just like in this, the apostles were given these 7 men the authority to take care of these widows, whatever that entailed. And the whole reason for that was so that they could continue with what they felt was most important for them and their abilities to continue teaching the word. So they took these 7 men, gave them the task of taking care of these widows so that they would not have to, spend their time taking care of that. Elders, helpers. That's a good way of looking at it, for sure. Right. Right. And we'll get into that some more. The work that deacons do, other people can help with and do. And even, I guess some people think when elders become elders, they're supposed to put their coat and tie on and not get their hands dirty with, showing up on work days and, cleaning out the gutters. But I don't see that anywhere in the Bible. I mean, elders can still, and elders are servants too, But as we said, deacons are there as servants and helpers to free the elders up to make sure that they get the things done that only elders can do, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's certain things that elders are responsible for and only they can do, and that's their top priority. So they can delegate, is a word we use in our English language. They can delegate some of these other tasks to people like the apostles did to these 7 men in Acts chapter 6. Right. 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 And going back to, not to dwell on Romans 16, but I mean, Phoebe was a servant and did some very important work. And some scholars think she may have actually been the one that carried this letter, to the church. So I mean, a very important task and something that was, affects even us today if that's what she did. So regardless of what title she had, she was definitely a servant of God, which is true for, women today. There's a lot of good work that women can do that they do a whole lot better than us men do when it comes to serving people.
We get hung up on the etymology, the hierarchy of things.
Right.
She's a servant.
She's a servant, yeah.
Of helping the nations.
Right.
She is a deaconess. She helps in administration.
Right.
Sandra Foster's deaconess. Taking care of communion and things in the fellowship hall.
Right. When you get down to just the root definition of servant, yes, we're all servants in that respect. But it does appear that there was, when you go back to Philippians 1:1, where it actually specifically it translates there as deacon, and it ties it with the overseers or elders. It indicates that there was and for lack of better, I don't like using the word office, but I don't know what other word to use there, but a position specifically sort of titled as deacon. And again, when you get into 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, you see a similar thing where, not Thessalonians, 1 Timothy chapter 3, where it lists these qualifications of deacons right after it's just gone over the qualifications of elders. So let's go there now to discuss these qualifications. First one is several there that you could kind of describe as their character. And we're not going to get all the way through this, I can see already, but we'll go ahead and start. Deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. So what do we have there as some of the characteristics? What does it mean to be dignified? Well respected, similar to, and you're going to see a lot of similarities here between what we've just been discussing about qualifications of elders as well. Not double-tongued. What does that mean? Yeah, not speaking out of both sides. Is not telling one person one thing and somebody else another. Why is that important for a deacon?
Well, it's like a little boy that tells a story. You gotta keep remembering what he told the first person.
Right.
Keep it all in mind. If he gets one thing out of line, it's gonna come back to bite him.
Yep.
And a deacon or an elder you want is the same way. If you tell me something, then you go tell them something totally different on the same subject, we have a problem.
Right. If you honesty. Right. right,
But it could be, you know, the way that we talk here in church services, and then you get out with the guys,
yeah.
and they're
That's,
talking one way, and you start using
Yeah.
the same verbiage they do.
I think
Well,
that's
pretty much a double tongue.
right, that's true. Right, right. And that's, again, it's one of those that all Christians should strive to not be double-tongued, right? Thinking every Christian, but think specifically about deacons and the jobs that they do. And if you even go back to Acts chapter 6, assuming that those men are deacons, and even if not even if maybe they weren't being called deacons at that point or in that, I believe they were, but even if they weren't, that's a task that we could easily see a deacon here doing as far as taking care of widows. Look at that situation they were in right there. What were these deacons or these 7 men being tasked to deal with? Deal with a problem, right? What was that specific problem?
Widows needing help and serving the neighbors,
Right,
whether that meant providing food or whether that meant taking care of the Lord's Supper. We don't have a designation.
right,
Others, they were seeing the need of the congregation.
right. And not just that, they were seeing to the need, you could see some somewhat segregation there of 2 different groups of women. One group felt like they weren't being served, but the other group was. So that can be right there you've got 2 different groups that they're having to deal with. So if they're, going and telling one group one thing and then turn around and telling the other group, they're not helping to resolve that issue. If anything, they would be making it worse. So, yeah. Right, yeah.
That notice in my Bible says the deacon service was meant to free the elders so they could give full attention to prayer and the ministry of the Lord.
Right. Yeah, and that's prayer and we glaze over that sometimes, and we'll get to that. One of the big responsibilities of elders is praying for the congregation, and that's a very big responsibility. So definitely deacons, when deacons do what they should do, can help free up the elders to focus on the more spiritual things. Right.
So, and just like Grace said, it's they're gonna take, I guess, to pick up I would say that the the stuff that the elder will assign the deacon to take care of while they can't foresee. More important stuff that the deacons not, I guess, supposed to be involved in certain things, you just,
Right.
there's, I guess, different levels of service,
Right.
and
Yeah.
The way I've always categorized it myself, the elders take care of the spiritual, deacons take care of the physical.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. That to some degree kind of pigeonholes you both a little bit, and I don't know that it's. I understand what you're saying, and that does help you kind of, for the most part, segregate the two. But there's some crossover there, I believe, too, as well, because like we said, That doesn't mean elders can't help attend to the physical, but it's more their main responsibility, right? Not addicted to much wine, I think is what some translations say. Some of you may have something different there. In verse 8, ESV says not addicted to much wine. Similar to what we already talked about with the elders, I think it's pretty clear why that would get in the way of a deacon serving in their capacity. And not greedy for dishonest gain. You know, this some think that this could, you know, may have to deal with, in some cases, like even, you know, with the widows. You know, sometimes there's money involved when it comes to deacons doing their job. So, you know, you don't want someone who's greedy for gain there. But, you know, this wording doesn't necessarily say anything about monetary gain. Again, I think this comes down to a deacon's motivation for being in that position. It could more come to do with power or seeing more in that job title than is really there, and wanting to hold themselves up above, you know, any other servant in the congregation. Any other thoughts on that?
King James does say not greedy of guilt.
What was that?
King James does say not greedy.
Right. King, what, just the King James translation there.
Not greedy of filthy lucre.
Yeah. Dishonest with money. Could be more, right? Yeah. Right. You definitely wouldn't want somebody out to advance their own personal standing by taking advantage to the people they're dealing with. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Again, we're picking this apart, but then we're going to have to come back and pull it all together, just like with elders. You've got to look at it all at one time. So we'll move on to kind of the spiritual side of it, so to speak, in verse 9, and we're going to run out of time, so we'll probably end up picking up here and finishing this discussion later. But ESV says they must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. I don't know if anyone else has some different wording on that.
Pure conscience is what my version has.
Pure conscience.
Which basically is the same as what you have.
Right. So what does verse 9 say about a deacon's characteristics from a spiritual standpoint? Right.
You know what the gospel is, the mystery is the gospel.
Right. Yeah, so why is a deacon, if all's they're responsible for the physical aspects of taking care of things, why do they need to be a spiritual, sound, faithful, clear conscience person? Right. Yeah, if you go look at Acts chapter 6, and if you hold the belief or assume that those men were deacons, they were also, again, deacon could be translated as minister. Some of those guys were evangelists. Stephen being one of them, who, you know, went to his death, you know, taking that stand. So. And if you look at Acts chapter 6, when they were appointing those 7, they did put some qualification on those 7 that was all mainly spiritual things, good repute, full of spirit, and wise. So if you lump that in with being faithful and clear conscience, that kind of paints a picture of a pretty spiritually sound, faithful Christian that's going to serve as a deacon.
Exactly. A child has a clear conscience because they don't know something is wrong.
Right.
And they act on something and it's wrong, but that's why we have to teach them. If you chose a deacon who was a childlike Christian, their conscience might be clear, but it can still be wrong. So we
Right.
gotta have someone who also is spiritually minded, who is mature in their faith, so that their clear conscience is clear because they know what's right and wrong.
Right. Yeah, I think there's not much argument there that, the tasks that deacons are given a lot of times by the elders, they need to be faithful Christians who are, know right from wrong, and it helps them navigate a lot of the things they're doing. So that's not real hard thing to grasp hold of. Any other comments on that? We're going to go ahead and just stop there, and I'll give you all a few minutes before we move into the next part, and we'll pick up with verse 10 next week. Well, thank y'all for your comments, and you can be reading those verse 10 through 12 before next week and be thinking on those things, and we'll discuss them next week.